Welcome to the 13th webinar of the Carnegie Knowledge Network on Value-Added Methods and Applications. My name is Jeannie Myung. I am the director of the Carnegie Knowledge Network, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. We are delighted to have with us today Susanna Loeb, who will address the question, how can value-added measures be used for teacher improvement? This is an important question because value-added measures are being collected in states and districts across the country. The hope is that these measures can be used to affect change that leads to better learning outcomes for students. Recently, you may have caught wind of the phrase, VAM is a sham. What does the research base have to say about the usefulness of value-added for different purposes? In the webinar, Susanna will describe what research can tell us about how the information we're collecting from value-added methods can be used to improve teaching and learning. A little bit of background on the Carnegie Knowledge Network. The Carnegie Foundation launched the CKN in response to the gap between the scholarly empirical research base on teacher quality and the design of accountability systems using value-added. We produce briefs and webinars that represent the rigor of current best knowledge on value-added in a relevant and accessible format. Several features distinguish the work of the CKN from other research products. We address questions practitioners raise, and we actively engage practitioners throughout the development of the content. She is one of 5 Carnegie panelists in the CKN who author the CKN products. This all represents the field's highest caliber of technical expertise from a range of perspectives without commercial interests around specific approaches. In this panel, we build scholarly consensus. And finally, we seek to inform prudent action in policy and practice. In just a moment, we will hear a presentation from Susanna Loeb, Professor of Education at Stanford University, where she is also the Faculty Director of the Center for Education Policy Analysis and a co-director of the Policy Analysis for California Education. Among numerous other notable distinctions, she is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Board for Education Sciences. She has field and research on teacher and principal labor markets. Most relevant to us today, she has authored a brief for the CKN on how value-added can be used for teacher improvement. In follows, Susanna will give an approximately 20-minute overview presentation of key findings from that brief. In the time that follows, she will respond to questions you may have. Please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to send questions to me, which I will then pose to Susanna at the close of presentation. Feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation. I'll also mention that the slides and audio will be made available after this webinar. And so with that, now to our main event, I'll turn it over to you, Susanna. Thanks for being here.
Hello. Thank you for joining us. The question for today is whether education leaders can use value-added measures as tools for improving schooling, and if they can, how can they do it? I think I can agree by now that value-added measures do not provide teachers with information on effective practices. But this doesn't mean that value-added measures can't be used for improving instruction through other means. So identifying practices that lead to higher academic achievement or targeting professional development towards teachers who need it most, there are the other ways that value-added can be used. As in other Carnegie Network value-added measures have shortcomings as measures of teaching performance relative to other options, but also have strengths. I'm going to start with some of the strengths. Typically, the use of test scores to measure teaching practices is both an advantage and a disadvantage. The clear benefit, though, is that however imperfect, test scores are direct measures of student learning, which is an outcome that we care about. Students learn more in school, tend to complete more schooling, they have greater earnings potential, they tend to lead healthier lives. Other measures, such as observation measures of teaching and principals assessments of teachers' performance, lack that direct link to valued outcomes such as student learning, and the research evidence that connects these other measures to student outcomes that we value, it does it only weakly. There's only a small relationship between the two. And, value-added measures recognize the complexity of the teaching process. There are many different teaching styles that can benefit students, and value-added measures allow for that. Those value-added measures adjust for characteristics of students in a given classroom. They're less biased measures of teacher performance than are other unadjusted test score measures, and may actually be less biased than some of the observational measures as well. As discussed in earlier brief, research provides evidence that value-added measures, at least those that pair teachers within the same school and adjust for their prior achievement, which many value-added measures do this adjustment for prior achievement, all of them, don't particularly favor teachers who teach certain types of students. So that's a particular strength of the value-added approach. But of course, there are also weaknesses. Value-added measures in particular are dependent on the specific tests that are used as the basis for it. Each test is an incomplete measure of all the outcomes we want to see, and the choice of tests can affect teachers' value-added estimates. So it's really important to recognize that, or to choose tests that measure outcomes that we care about, but also to recognize that those tests are incomplete. So it's shortcoming, which I've already mentioned, is the inability to provide information about specific teaching practices. So if you think of value-added as something that's supposed to be informative for teacher improvement, it really doesn't serve that purpose as well. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, measures are very imprecise. A fair amount of evidence suggests that they do a decent job adjusting for differences in student background characteristics and the students the teachers teach. On average, an individual teacher score is not going to be an accurate measure of his or her performance. Multiple years of value-added provide better information, more accurate picture than does just 1 year, but even multiple year measures are not precise. So given the precision of value-added measures and their inability to provide information about specific teaching practices, we'd want to conclude that they can't be a useful tool for improvement. And I think that's what Jeannie was referring to. A number of people have concluded that, but I think this conclusion would be premature. State, district, school leaders making decisions, value-added measures may aid in school improvement in at least 3 ways, and that would be the focus of most of this discussion today. This is improving programs themselves, not directly targeted to teachers, but to other kinds of decisions. Used for making decisions about human resources, and might be able to be used to develop incentives for better performance. And I'm going to go through each of these one by one. So first, let's consider program improvement. When deciding how to invest resources or which programs to continue or expand, education leaders can benefit from information on whether those programs are achieving their goals. Ideally, they would have access to random control trials, very sophisticated assessments of how effective those programs are, but that is, in almost all cases, just not practical. Valid measures are an alternative if programs that you want to assess are aimed to improve teacher effectiveness in some ways. For example, a district might want to know whether a professional development offering is improving teacher performance in a particular subject or grade. And in questions like that, if the program serves large enough numbers of teachers, value-added measures can distinguish between the improvement of teachers who participated in the program and those who did not. Value measures are likely to be at least as informative, if not more informative, than some of the more typically available measures, such as teachers' own assessments of how useful their experiences are, and they're more useful on an unadjusted test scores of students, because those measures don't adjust for student background characteristics, or they require greater expertise to analyze, because you have to do that adjustment in the process of analyzing it instead of basing it on measures that have those adjustments built in. However, one might worry that value-added measures are too imprecise even to measure the improvement of teachers in a program, and that actually is a concern. Information is more of an issue with value-added measures of teacher improvement than it is for measures of static effectiveness. If we think about improvement, measuring the difference between a teacher's effectiveness at the beginning of the period and his or her effectiveness at the end of the period. Change over time will be subject to errors both in that beginning score and in that end score, and that means that value added as a measure of improvement, particularly when it's based on only one measure at the beginning and one measure at the end, can be really, really imprecise. We need many years of data on both before and after intervention to know whether an individual teacher improved. However, because multiple teachers participate in the program evaluators can combine measures across the teachers and reduce this problem of imprecision. The more teachers they are, the more precise the measures of the average effect is. On enough teachers, researchers can estimate average improvement of teachers over time, and they can identify the effects of professional development or other programs and practices on teacher improvement. Just as an example, studies have used test performance to measure teacher effectiveness adjusted for background characteristics and have demonstrated that on average, teachers are more effective during their second year of teaching than they are during their first year of teaching, and more effective in their third year, they're in their second year. So the use of value added to measure improvement is feasible. This is kind of evidence that it's feasible. And researchers have also shown that this improvement can be different in different schools depending on the context in which the teacher works. So ways of using value added to measure teachers' improvement when teachers are aggregated so you have a large enough sample. For some kinds of program improvement, you don't even need measures of improvement. You can use some of the static measures, just the one-time measures of value added. And one example of this would be for teacher hiring. For example, let's say a district is trying to decide which teacher to hire, knowing which pre-service teacher preparation programs have provided particularly effective teachers in the past, help in selecting teachers that are more likely to thrive. So you can say, hey, I know these programs have produced teachers that work well in my district, so I'm going to look for those. And in assessing which have worked well, you could use the value-added measures. And it's similar for teacher characteristics when you're doing that hiring. Value-added measures, I just wanted to point out that here we're using a static measure, so the imprecision is still there, but it's not quite as bad. So added measures can be used for program improvement. This means through which value-added measures may be used for improvement is provide information for making better human resource decisions about individuals. And this is the type of process that has gotten the most attention. Value-added may be imprecise for individual teachers on average. Teachers with lower value-added on average will be less effective in the long run than those with higher value-added on average. So they still provide some kinds of information that education leaders can use to make decisions. Just as an example, instead of offering professional development to all teachers equally, decision makers might target teachers who appear to need it the most based on value-added measures. Might also use the measures as the basis for promotion or dismissal. The measures, again, are imprecise, and this will lead to errors, but all measures of performance are imprecise, and HR decisions need to be made. It makes sense to use multiple measures of performance, but among those multiple measures, value-added may provide useful information depending really on what other measures are available. So which is only now emerging on the usefulness of value-added for making human resource decisions. One district, for example, gave principal value-added information on novice teachers, gave to principals, but continued to let principals use their own judgment in decisions about teacher renewal. In this case, principals changed their behavior as a result, provide evidence that value-added gave them either new information or some leverage for acting on the information they already had. So here's a case where value-added was used, and it actually changed the decisions, but it wasn't used in a formulaic way. In districts, the Talent Transfer Initiative identified high-performing teachers and offered them incentives for moving to and staying in low-performing schools for at least a couple of years. The teachers moved were found to have positive effects on their students in the new schools, especially in elementary schools. There are really many possible uses of value added for these types of decisions for districts, and researchers are only beginning to understand their effects. There's some possibilities at the school level for using value-added measures, and there's even less research on this. But just as an example, principals can use them to assure that students aren't consistently assigned to low value-added or what may be less effective teachers, or they might use added measures to assign teachers to classes where they appear to have particularly strong effects, such as in elementary school, assigning to math instead of to English language arts. Although human resource decisions is a second one, a final potential way to use value-added measures to improve schools is to provide teachers with incentives for better performance. Conceptually, linking salaries to student outcomes seems like a logical way to improve teacher effort or to attract teachers most likely to produce student test score gains. Performance-based pay, for example, may create incentives for teachers to focus on learning or for higher performing teachers to enter or remain in the profession. However, in practice, there are shortcomings. Value-added measures don't capture all aspects of student learning that matter, and giving teachers incentives to focus on outcomes that are measured may shortchange students on important outcomes that aren't measured. First, it's difficult to create performance-pay systems that encourage teachers to treat their students equitably. Formulas often reward teachers for concentrating on students more likely to make gains on tests or to reach particular thresholds. Some performance pay policies may also discourage teachers from cooperating with each other. While this evidence that performance pay can work, most of the evidence from the U.S. suggests that it does not increase student performance. The largest study of performance incentives based on value-added measures comes from a Nashville, Tennessee study that reassigned middle school math teachers who volunteered for the study to be eligible for performance-based pay or not. Those who were eligible could earn annual bonuses of up to $15,000, so the bonuses were big. The study showed very little effect of these incentives on student performance. The results do mean that value-added measures can't be used productively as incentives. Evidence from Kenya and India, for example, suggests that they can, but the failure of the programs in the U.S. provides evidence that they are really quite difficult to implement productively. On the other hand, some evidence suggests that programs that combine value-added with other measures of performance or which use other measures of performance without value-added can lead to improvement. The observation-based evaluation in Cincinnati, for example, led to improvement in teacher effectiveness, as has the impact evaluation system in Washington, D.C. Both of these programs provide feedback to teachers on their instructional practice. It's clear how much of the improvement comes from the feedback in combination with the incentives and how much comes from the incentives on their own. So in comparison, this last fact about the performance pay with value-added versus in combination or with other performance measures points to the question, while value-added measures may be used as instruments of improvement through program improvement, human resource decisions, and incentives, are other measures better tools. Value-added measures don't tell us which measures of practice are don't tell us which measures of teacher practice are effective, whereas other measures of performance can. But these measures can be more costly to collect, and we don't know nearly as much about their validity or their bias as we do for value-added. More value-added may allow us to target the collection of these more costly measures, which in turn can help school leaders determine which teachers could benefit most from assistance. These are really the questions about how different measures are used in practice and used in combination or used separately. That it again may allow for this targeting that then gets to use the benefits of the other kinds of measures. So this leads me to what more needs to be known. There's substantial information already on the technical properties of value-added measures. However, far less is known about how these measures are put into actual use. It may, for example, be helpful to assign our students to the most effective teachers, to give less effective teachers a chance to improve, which would equal access to highly qualified instruction. You could pay highly effective teachers more. That's just one example of how you might use it, but we have no evidence of the effectiveness of this approach. Districts using value added to make sure that their lowest performing students have access to effective teachers, but we know little about the outcomes of this practice. So little evidence that value added can be justified as a reason for more intensive teacher evaluation, that example I was just giving. These are promising, and research could illuminate their benefits and costs. It would also benefit from more information on the value added as a performance incentive. For example, while we have ample evidence of unintended consequences of test-based accountability, as well as evidence of some potential benefits, we know less about the consequences of using value-added measures to encourage educators to improve. Performance incentives have little effect on teacher performance in the short run. It may not be worth pursuing them as a means for improvement at all. However, incentives may affect who enters and stays in teaching, and we know little about these potential effects. Moreover, the research suggests that value-added scores may be more effective as incentives when they're combined with other observational and other measures that give teachers information on practice. It would be useful to have more evidence on combining measures for this and for other purposes. This research only goes so far, so there are a bunch of places that we need evidence from research, and a lot of them have to do with the use of it in practice and less about the technical parts of the score itself. But that said, research only goes so far. So I wanted to talk briefly about what can't be resolved by empirical evidence on this issue. Research can inform the use of value-added measures. Most decisions about how to use these measures require personal judgment as well as a greater understanding of school and district factors than research can provide. Political feasibility and repercussions of choices, for example, will vary by jurisdiction. Some districts and schools are more accepting than others of value-added as measures of performance, and these will have implications for how useful they are, how able places are to implement them, and then how useful they are once they're implemented. It also provides more relevant information in some districts than it does in others. When school leaders are ready, have a good understanding of teachers' skills, value-added measures may not add much, but they are helpful for leaders who are new to the job or less skilled at evaluating teachers through other means. Moreover, in some places, the tests used to calculate value added are better measures of desired outcomes than they are in other places. An interim measure of student learning, only one indicator of how prepared students are to succeed in their life, committees will no doubt come to different conclusions about how relevant these tests are as measures of the preparation that they value. The capacity of the system to calculate value added and to collect information will also affect the usefulness and the cost effectiveness of the measures. Some critical pieces must be in place if value added is to provide useful information about programs. For example, you need data on student outcomes as measured by well-designed tests, and be able to link teachers to students over time. Without this capacity, collecting and calculating value-added measures will be costly and time-consuming, but with it, the measures can be calculated relatively easily. So just briefly to summarize, value-added measures clearly do not provide useful information for teachers about practices they need to improve. They simply gauge student test gains, relative to what we would expect the students to learn. Value-added measures also have drawbacks for assessing individual teacher effectiveness because they're precise. On average, they do not appear to be biased against teachers teaching different kinds of students within the same school. They are definitely subject to measurement error. Nonetheless, they can still be a useful tool for improving practice, especially in combination with other measures. In particular, value-added measures can support the evaluation of programs and practices, they contribute to human resource decisions, and they can be used as incentives to improve performance. Examples: value-added measures allow education leaders to assess the effectiveness of professional development relatively easily. They can identify schools with particularly good learning environments for teachers. They help school leaders with teacher recruitment and selection by providing information on preparation programs that have delivered effective teachers in the past. They help leaders make decisions about teacher assignment and promotion. They may even be used to create incentives for teacher performance. That is sometimes better than other measures of effectiveness, just other measures are sometimes superior to value-added. Nation protocols, for example, are more useful than value-added measures in some contexts because they provide teachers with information on specific teaching practices, but the observational tools have other potential drawbacks, and they haven't been assessed nearly as carefully as value-added measures have for basic validity, to connections to outcomes we care about, or for precision, for reliability. In addition to being costly to collect, observational measures that favor particular teaching practices may encourage a type of teaching that's not always best. Observational measures may adjust well for different teaching contexts, and even when educators use these protocols, additional, less formal feedback is really useful to support teachers' development. So all this to say is that those measures are good and useful, but they also have their drawbacks. They're trade-offs, and often these measures are best used in combination. Let me conclude by saying that value-added measures, as I've written here, are imperfect, but they're one of many imperfect measures of teacher performance that can inform decisions by teachers, schools, districts, and states. Questions of tenure and promotion are definitely not the only areas of potential use. Thanks.
Thanks for the presentation, Susanna. It sounds like value-added measures are imprecise and provide limited information about how to improve practice. Alone, they may not provide the best information for practice improvement or for individual teacher evaluation, but they can still be a valuable source of information on groups of teachers, for improvement programs, and potentially for incentives. We now have the opportunity to post questions to Susanna. Thanks to those who have already submitted questions. For additional questions, please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll do our best to get through them all. So let's start with a question on value-added for improving hiring decisions. Are there any examples that you know of, Susanna, of large urban districts using value-added of their current teachers to identify effective teacher preparation programs to improve their hiring in the future?
So that is a good question. There are some states. Louisiana was working on this, as some of you know, I'm sure know, and I think Tennessee has done some things in it. New York City had an analysis that wasn't specific to preparation programs, but did look at the value added of different characteristics of teachers that they could judge before hiring. So through different kinds of screening, they get measures at hiring, and then seeing how those predict teachers' effectiveness later on, and then in that way trying to validate whether those are good measures for selection.
And also direct listeners to Dan Goldhaber's recent brief in the Carnegie Knowledge Network on this idea of using value added to evaluate teacher preparation programs. That can be found on our Carnegie Knowledge Network website. We have a question on for the misuse of value added. Do you see potential for widespread misuse of value added policy applications? For instance, for just the lowest 5%, and that 5%, the potential of firing the wrong people?
Certainly, I think, of course, there is clear potential for misuse, and I think misuse in some ways is it's an easy thing to do because the measures are so clear that they're a number and they they feel like there's something real. And to a certain extent, they are real things, but there may be better information available. And I think when you have to make a decision, for example, if you need to lay off 5% of teachers or something like that because of budget cuts, then you want to think, okay, how can I do this with the least cost to the students there? Value added may be useful for that, or there may be other measures that are available at the time that are kind of more predictive of how effective those teachers are at helping students achieve what you want them to achieve. So I think it depends on the context of about whether they will be useful or won't be useful in a decision like you're talking about. But there's definitely the opportunity to misuse them by using them as the only measure or by relying on them just because they seem more concrete than other kinds of measures.
Mm-hmm. Using them as the only objective measure, and precision that could lead to errors. And on this issue of the implications of policy on the use of value added, this is related to just outside of factors outside of the control of the teacher. How does NCLB's emphasis on tutoring for performing schools impact value added results for general classroom teachers?
No, that's a very good question. So, for example, I think tutoring is tutoring of all students, or let's say you have an aide that comes into the classroom and that aide is very effective, or similarly, let's say a principal sees that one teacher is struggling and so puts a coach in with that teacher, and then the value added is it looks much better than probably the teacher's own contribution to student learning. I think that's why programs that use value added in combination with other kinds of information and allow for some subjective judgment, for example, that program that gave principals information but then allowed them to make decisions on their own with the knowledge of context, what kinds of supports were the students receiving from other people aside from those teachers, is a really important part of using it well.
We have a question about, I guess, the sustainability of some of the findings you suggest here. Is there enough information out there to use value added in the 3 ways you describe? What might be needed?
Yeah, well, that's. I think I'm just going to give myself a number of times just saying, well, it depends on what alternatives are available. You have to make a decision. So I think when you need to make a decision, and as we point out in a different one of these briefs, there are lots of decisions out there that have to be made, whether they're made by just ignoring it and not making any decision, or whether it's made using other kinds of information. Those decisions about human resources and which professional development program and all of those things are just continually being made. So you have to make some kinds of decisions. And question is whether there's enough information to know if value added is useful. I actually do think there's enough information that value added is providing information that is related to things that we care about in the future for students. So teachers with higher value added, a teacher who's higher value added does seem to generally benefit you in the long run. There's also information out there that shows that it's a very imperfect measure. Just as one example, some teachers can have the same value added, but much of what students learn with them will stick a lot in the next year and in future years for some teachers and not for other teachers. So we really want to figure out, if we add an observational measure, something like that, can we get more of that long-run effect that we care about? I think there is plenty of room for additional information, and that is just kind of a function of life, and the information can always be better. But I think there is enough information out there that points to both the disadvantages and the worries of value added because of its imprecision and because of its just focus on student test scores versus other kinds of outcomes. But at the same time, there's information that says, well, but it is part of what we value, and maybe we can get information from that as well.
Mm-hmm. To your closing point, value added may be imperfect, but it's still useful, potentially for other purposes. We have some interest in how we could use value added to target professional development. Can you explain how value added can be used to target PD to teachers who need it most? Can you provide guidance to districts who would like to tie value added to professional development?
Yeah, so I think, well, in kind of the most simple example, if you have a teacher who is clear value added, is struggling to have her students learn the material, or students learn the material, that is a good case for saying, okay, what can we do? What kinds of supports can we provide? Professional development kinds of supports that will help that teacher be able to make gains with his or her students. So that's one way. You take a bunch of teachers, maybe third grade teachers whose students aren't learning in English language arts, and you say, okay, let's make sure, let's give these teachers particular help, because part of what we want to do is make sure that no student has teachers who really aren't adding to their learning. And so by concentrating the efforts with those least effective teachers, that could be one useful way. And of course, another way is to see who's particularly effective, and you might do it only with value added or in combination, and say, okay, well, let's try to see, let's either match teachers who are less effective to those more effective teachers, or try to see what those more effective teachers are doing in order to help students in the way they're doing.
You mentioned that the knowledge base on the statistical properties of value added is pretty well established among researchers like yourself, but it's less well understood how it will be used in practice. We have a question here with a hypothesis. The imprecision of value added makes it difficult to get teachers to believe that value added is an accurate portrayal of their teaching. Their belief seems necessary for programs of performance incentives to work. What do you think of this?
So it depends what your performance incentives is based on. And I don't think our knowledge is at all perfect. Again, this is a question of use and what we know about how you use things. My own hypothesis at this point is that it's very hard to incentivize someone to do something where they don't really know what it is they're supposed to do. And because of that, incentives around more concrete things that teachers can do, such as practice outlined by observational protocols, whether or not those are perfect, are much easier things for people to respond to. They say, okay, I can do that, and someone's going to come back and see if I'm doing that, and so I'm going to try to do that. It's much harder to say, okay, I am going to affect change in somebody else. I'm going to try to improve their health or improve their achievement. That's a really amorphous goal, and those amorphous goals, I think, are really much more difficult to respond to under incentives. So my sense is that it's nice to have incentives based on things that are concrete for people to respond to. I don't think we have evidence at this point that that's really what's going on, but we do have some evidence that the incentive systems that were solely based on performance have been particularly effective in the U.S., while some of these more recent ones that involve both continuous feedback and in that feedback is continuous assessment over concrete things have led to some kinds of improvement.
So that has implications for the design incentive parameters. On the issue of teacher incentives, we have a question about some of the international studies that you cited. The articles you mentioned from India and Kenya are not straightforward examples of how value added might be used as an incentive for teachers. Evidence from those studies suggests to change their practices, pedagogy, or homework assignments, they conducted more test prep sessions instead. What can we learn from these studies about school improvement, where test scores not, but it wasn't necessarily based on instructional changes so much as test prep?
I think there is some variation in that as well. So that was true in some of the studies, but not in all of the studies, where sometimes there was some increased time on instruction and things like that as well. I mean, I do think the conclusion in the U.S. is not positive, so I'm not sure that I'm the right person to argue for how we can make performance-based pay based on value-added an effective strategy. I do think if we have it, we might want to look at who it attracts in. I'm actually not convinced it will attract in people who are more effective either. So I don't want to say that I think that's a particularly promising approach, but I know other people think that it is, and I don't think that we currently have evidence on whether it is or not.
Okay. We have a question about value-added. You can learn from value-added to apply to all the other teachers who don't have value-added. Since the majority of teachers do not have value-added scores, how can we address hiring other decisions of significance using value-added?
Yeah, well, I actually think this points to use of value-added in kind of the first thing that I was talking about, which was using it to see if different things work. So we use value-added, we have it. We use student test scores, we have it to see if teachers with certain kinds of skills or practices are effective in this realm. And then we just have to extrapolate through our sense of what makes a good teacher about whether it's useful in that realm as well. And some places we'll probably have arguments for where it is, and in some places we won't. But some of the practices that are included in these observational protocols are really quite similar across different kinds of teaching. You know, some of what it takes to be a good teacher is quite similar across tested and untested areas. And those cases, we can learn from value-added what kinds of knowledge and skills are useful for teachers to have. So I think it can be useful there. And I guess I'll have to think about it. I do think that supplementing that with some kinds of value-added in other areas, but maybe not on the scale of a whole district, more at a research level, to see whether student learning in grades that don't have value added, for example, in kindergarten, well, maybe not kindergarten, but you wouldn't want to use probably typical assessments in kindergarten, but you might want measures of child development and seeing what characteristics of teachers contribute to that child development, whether it's social emotional or cognitive or whatever it is. You can create measures of what a good teacher is based on student outcomes and then see what kind of practices work. So I think there are uses for value added in those kinds of contexts that don't mean that places have to put in tests in every subject.
So there's potential to leverage learning from value added to generalize to other areas, and there may be some learning that we could take from the general value added approach that we could apply to other areas as well. We have a question about the role of the federal government and the state level in the use of value added for improvement. What's the role of the federal government and states in using value added in the three ways you presented?
Yes, so I think the federal government has, of course, focused much more on the HR decisions parts of it than they focused on the rest, particularly in the places that have gotten raced to the top. Now, whether that's the most productive way, I don't know. I don't have a way of evaluating it, but I think that's the focus that they've taken. Nonetheless, just the availability of tests in such a large scale and measures of how well students are doing was incentivized strongly by the federal government, and that's provided lots of opportunities for learning about how to support kids, how to support teachers for greater educational opportunities. So I think they've done some incentivizing from the federal level around collecting information that's been useful, but the part about using value added has been targeted much more towards these HR decisions, a bit towards incentives, I guess, and not nearly as much towards program evaluation and learning about what effective practice is, as I think
there's opportunity for use of value added for program evaluation in the federal and state levels. I guess they could be, do best value-added models exist? The question here asks what states or districts have the best value-added model in your opinion. There's some best practices to note in model design or model choice.
So I think some controls for students' prior achievement, and preferably the prior achievement of other kids in the class, is kind of main thing. If you have multiple measures of students' performance going into the class and those are adjusted in the model, those are going to be stronger models. After that, whether it's different types of models used, there's evidence that, I mean, this is kind of getting into the weeds, but ones that have the student fixed X in them are less stable, so you probably don't want to use those. But among the ones that are commonly used in practice, I'm probably not the one to assess if there's a one best practice there. I don't think there is. I think all of the ones that are currently being used, they're often really quite similar, and how easily they're understood and for what they are really, which is the difference between how well the students do in the class, how well you would predict they would have done by the characteristics they brought in. That value added is. And just want to be able to argue that you have adjusted well for the characteristics that the students brought into the class. And that really is all that a value added measure is. And the different approaches will have implications for individual teachers who are very close to kind of cutoffs, if you're focusing on cutoffs. But in terms of if you're not focusing as much as on cutoffs and just looking at how teachers look through the different models, they'll actually look fairly similar. They'll be quite highly correlated.
Okay. So they're similar than different. So this model choice may not be as consequential.
As they're good controls for student prior achievement. That's really, really important.
That's the important thing, that we're controlling for student prior achievement. We have a question about a comment you made, a correlation between value added and years of experience. Does the observation that teachers are more effective in their second year than their first, and yet in their third than their second, argue against the use of value added in 4 years of experience as a measure of teacher quality? Why or why not?
So does it argue against the use of value added? I didn't understand what you said. 4 years of experience?
For the years of experience teacher, which we have been doing for years.
Actually, no. So I think it does demonstrate that on average teachers learn, but just as an example, we divided teachers into, I think, 5 different groups based on their value added in the first 2 years of teaching, and even in the first year or the first 2 years, and even after 5 years, the group at the bottom hadn't caught up. Even though they improved, they hadn't caught up with where the average teacher was the very first year. Mm-hmm. So this is just to say there is, while on average teachers get better over time, the variation within the given level of experience is much greater. And particularly actually for teachers at the top, the ones who begin at with value added really do tend to maintain high value added, all of them clearly, but a lot of them throughout the times that we can observe them.
Okay, within teachers of the same number of years of experience that we capture. We just use years of experience as a measure.
And that variation is greater than the variation by years of experience.
Okay. A question, another international comparison question. How unique is the United States in terms of using student achievement growth measures to try to make human resource decisions or improve programs for that matter? Do other nations value-added type measures, and what do they do with them?
So yes, not very much. I don't know that's available everywhere, but most countries do not test kids a year and link those tests to teachers. So that is a rare thing, and it's only new in the U.S. as well. So no, it's not a common thing to do internationally.
In the highest performing nations.
Yes, definitely among the highest performing nations.
Do you know, catching on to what we're doing, do they think, have you engaged with some of the other countries and gotten a sense of what their opinion is on the way we're doing teacher evaluations?
Again, I just want to make sure to emphasize that value added for teacher evaluation is not the only way that value added can be helpful, and in fact, it may not be the best way that it can be helpful. I do think there's interest internationally in using value added to understand teaching practice, to understand what good teaching practice is, to understand what good programs are, and potentially to understand about individual teachers. So I've talked with people internationally who are very interested in it, and particularly within countries, some places are collecting data that follow students over time and can link them to teachers, and are trying to use this kinds of information, but really on the kinds of scales that we have in some of the states.
Okay.
But even in the U.S., they're not being used that much for evaluation.
And you said many states are coupling value added, or most states are coupling value added with other measures. What are ways to ensure evaluation frameworks minimize the weaknesses that you mentioned? This means teacher evaluation systems and the balance between the measures.
Yeah, so we have a brief on this too, and this wasn't quite the focus of this. My own sense is this again is a question of their use in practice, and that we need more information on how to use them well. My guess is there's like using multiple measures, allowing some subjective judgment in addition to the measures. So having less full evaluations by principals or other kinds of observers in there. And then I think the other issue isn't about the measures, but about the decisions being made. So it's much better, I think, to make many, many decisions that each have small implications and from which we can learn than is to have one time when you make the most important decision and no other feedback or no other measures used anywhere. Because if you make many decisions along the way and learn from them about individual teachers, then less likely to run into the problems that you'll clearly run into if you say, okay, I'm just going to measure value added at this one time and base your whole career on the answers that we get from these calculations. I mean, I think that is clearly not the optimal way to run an HR system. Make the best use of the people who are there, and also to encourage them to help them improve.
Using value-added and evaluation information to just make a big one-time decision may not be the best way to use it. A question about variation in scores across these different measures. One observation that has gotten attention recently is that value-added scores have a much bigger range and regular distribution than other measures, such as observation protocols. What does this tell us about value-added and those other measures?
So, that's completely right. So I think what you're trading off is you have a much more consistent measure in some of these other measures, and in value-added you have a measure that's much more directly tied to something that has to do with children and what children are learning. And so, and there are benefits to both. So in the one, let's say you've got some observational measure. It's good because it is measuring something that we think will lead to student improvement, but we don't really know it will. And we can measure it very well because it is just a practice that we see, whereas contributions to something are clearly harder because there are other factors going on that make numbers bounce around, even just how kids are feeling the day of the test. And so it's really a drawback, the imprecision of it and not knowing how accurate it is. But you are getting something about students, and I think there's a lot to be said for knowing whether students are making that progress, whether it is on the kinds of tests we're measuring now or on other kinds of outcomes for students that we really, really care about.
So nearing the end of the hour, but we have one more question for you in closing, Susanna. Again, coming back to this hypothesis, the understanding of the teacher's understanding of value added to inform improvement. If value added is to be used for teacher improvement, teachers must understand it. From your experience, do teachers understand value added, or is it seen more as a black box? Do you know of any states, districts, or vendors who have done this well, that is, help teachers understand what value added is?
So I've certainly had places, and I don't want to mention particular places, where it really was a black box. I think initially it really was a black box, and in many places it still is black box. I mean, the simplest thing is that I think teachers really can understand is what the average test score means are of their students. And really what value added is, except then it adjusts it for the different characteristics coming in. Supposedly, and I don't have direct evidence of that, but supposedly some of the measures, the percentile growth measures, so you see how much each in your class grows relative to other kids who at that exact same point. Some people think those are easier for teachers to understand and buy into than other kinds of measures, but they seem easier to me, so it's hard for me to really think that they're easier to understand. I actually think it's about the measure itself and more about how it's explained. I can't give you a particular place that's done a good job of it. I'd have to think about that, but certainly it is important to try to have a measure be described in ways that are understandable. And again, this is all about evaluation, and I don't want to say that value added is good for evaluation. I think there are lots of places outside evaluation or as part of a more complex evaluation system that are both probably a better choice and also more acceptable for teachers.
Great. All right, thank you, Susanna. So with that, we will bring the webinar to a close. Thanks to all of you for listening in. We will post the slides and audio of Susanna's presentation, as well as a transcript of the Q&A shortly. And if you haven't already and you'd like to go more in depth into Susanna's take on value added for improvement, be sure to visit the Carnegie Knowledge Network website and download the PDF of her brief. And in other CK Ed news, today we launched a brief by Dan McCaffrey on Is Value Added Accurate for Teachers of Students with Disabilities? His webinar on that topic will be on February 7th, and we'll look forward to having all of you participate in that webinar as well. So once again, thanks, Susanna, and thanks to all who listened in. And so in our next webinar, have a great afternoon.